Welcome everyone to the sixth and last in our series of conversations with Sammies finalists this summer. I'm Jordan Lapierre, Public Relations Director at the Partnership for Public Service, and your host for today's conversation. I'm so glad that you could join us on this Friday afternoon. A year ago this month, the United States began withdrawing from Afghanistan, and that meant tens of thousands of Afghan nationals who had worked with and supported the US government, not to mention the American civilians and other allies living there, needed to be evacuated for their safety. And what unfolded happened in two parts, with teams across government working together to make it possible under the most challenging of circumstances. First, a system to identify those needing evacuation and to process their departures had to be implemented. And then, once Afghan nationals had reached safety and temporary housing at US military bases, an entirely new system of permanent resettlement had to be designed, with very little of the infrastructure established after years of neglect. And our guests today were key players in solving both of these challenges. Hila Hanif is Director of Afghanistan Strategy and Policy at the Department of Defense, and her team designed the process to determine who needed to be evacuated and how, resulting in more than 120,000 people, including Afghan nationals, US citizens, and other NATO allies, being ferried to safety in the days and weeks following the withdrawal announcement. And Kira Burdiner is a program officer at the State Department and part of a small but mighty team who undertook the largest resettlement in US history, working with local partners to give more than 70,000 Afghan evacuees a chance to start a new life in welcoming communities all across America. Thank you both so much for being here, and congratulations to you both on being Sammies finalists. We're delighted to be able to lift up the story that you have both been involved in. So Hila, I want to start with you because I want to walk through this in kind of a chronological fashion. So you and your team saw that the situation was deteriorating in Afghanistan and knew there would be a need to prepare for a potential evacuation. And talk us through how you had prepared in advance of that announcement and what had to be figured out in real time as conditions changed.
Great, thanks, Jordan, and thanks for helping to organize this event. So the process for organizing what an evacuation would look like actually started months and months ahead of the actual evacuation. So if there's one thing that DoD does very well, it's planning for different scenarios. And so we had different military plans in place for several months, but those plans are based on some hypothetical conditions and hypothetical numbers. And so over the summer in particular, leading up to the evacuations, we spent months doing different types of scenarios and exercises that included first different DoD participants, but then also interagency, in particular the Department of State and the White House and DHS and others, in looking at different scenarios. So for example, if there is an evacuation because of security conditions, would it just be small scale and for US citizens? Would it involve citizens from other embassies and nations, or would it be what we ended up seeing, which is a larger scale evacuation of Afghans as well? And so the plans had been in place in months, but of course, when a situation like that actually happens, some of the details are different from what you had anticipated, and that's where some of the real-time adjustments had to take place.
So take us back to when the withdrawal started happening and your reaction to that moment and what you and your team did next.
So while the entire summer was pretty intense for our entire office, and not just our office, there were several offices within DoD that were very instrumental in making the entire thing happen. The week in particular leading up to the fall of Kabul was, I think, a very kind of emotional and stressful week where when we saw different cities actually falling to Taliban control, I think we're anticipating that the situation was rapidly deteriorating. And I remember it was a Saturday morning where my team and I received calls very early to come into the office and prepare for a potential larger scale evacuation. And so at the time, a lot of an evacuation is really operational. So it's really our military colleagues in particular, those who are there on the ground, either preparing to deploy or already in country, who are taking care of the logistics of thinking about the security conditions, thinking about getting the military flights out, et cetera. and then working with the Department of State on the actual, some of the immigration type of work that you would typically have when you let somebody on a plane into another country. But what we were trying to figure out real time are the policy issues that we would have to figure out as this evacuation ended up being implemented. And so what we ended up doing was just having teams from our office and others thinking about a few categories. So one was, how do we, in a limited period of time, how do we try to quickly process some of the people who had worked to support DoD throughout the years of our involvement in Afghanistan? How do we quickly process them to be eligible for the evacuations? And then also, how do we look at where what we call the lily pads, the different countries where they would first be evacuated before they got to the US or elsewhere? How do we make sure that there is enough capacity in those different places? And so these are the types of things, in addition to the fact that we were receiving calls all day long from different interest groups who are also trying to help different groups of Afghans, either individuals or other groups that they knew, people who are particularly vulnerable. So whether they're DoD members who had other Afghans, such as interpreters or others they had worked with, or there were people who had worked with civil rights activists or other women's groups and they're affiliated with DoD, figuring out how to process and manage those was just something we had to figure out in real time.
So you've hinted at some of this already, but to dig a little bit deeper, there are a ton of processes in place for how refugee resettlement would normally work, or how you would normally get people out of a country. But a lot of those processes had to be streamlined and had to happen really fast in this case. Can you talk us through how you were able to identify ways to streamline those processes and who got pulled in from across various agencies to make that happen?
Sure. Well, again, there was foresight on the part of others in my office, including my boss, Rebecca Zimmerman, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and others who are working specifically on the humanitarian and refugee issues. And so they had actually worked for months in the interagency process. There are different categories of people who the U.S. government wanted to prioritize to be evacuated. But from a Department of Defense perspective, the subset of people that we were looking at in particular are those who had served alongside U.S. forces. And so it was months of work to figure out how to designate and how to process some of these people, including how to make sure we had background checks, how we could verify who had worked with DoD. That had been put into place months before, but what happened real time was to figure out how to put those people in the system as they were either approaching the gates or calling us or emailing us or asking to get to the gates. And so for that, we actually just started with, we had a system, a spreadsheet, a database that was already put in place months ago. But we started calling for volunteers throughout the department of people who could quickly be trained up and essentially processing the requests. We had to set up 24-hour shifts so that there are people who could do these requests day and night. And then while we started out with a big whiteboard within the office, whereby we would make sure that as the emails came in, we could make sure they're assigned to one of our volunteers. Eventually the scale got so big that we had to switch to something digital. And so real time, there were people creating email aliases. We had to kind of suppress how we filter the emails, because some of my team members, we were not only getting requests for the refugee designation, but we're also dealing with other work involved in the evacuation. So just triaging the information and making sure that, we all felt very personally responsible in being as responsive as we could to all the requests. There was a certain point whereby the scale got greater than what we could do real time. But I think our mentality is that, if there's anybody there who's waiting at the gates, and if there's something that we can do to help either one person or one family get through, then it's worth the effort, even though we couldn't guarantee the outcome.
So as you've identified, this took a ton of creative problem solving from a lot of different people. Can you point to one example of a really big challenge that had to be tackled creatively in a short period of time, something that particularly stands out that you're really proud of?
I would say that it actually started in the beginning, where the process itself by which DoD would figure out how we could be involved in nominating refugees into the State Department system. that was meant to be something long-term and over a larger period of time than hours or days. And so I have a colleague in particular who worked with our boss to get permission and approval just to do the designations and the nominations real time. And so, we had a senior official who had to approve every single one. And so just on the first day when we knew that the evacuations would take place, the fact that we were able to come up with a process by which we could do these real time instead of over the course of weeks, I think that's pretty remarkable. With government processes, usually takes time, to get through the bureaucracy. And there is so much support from the highest levels of leadership to figure out how to cut through normal processes to make things happen fast. I think that was truly a remarkable achievement of a lot of my colleagues.
So you also mentioned those lily pads. So after folks were evacuated from Afghanistan, they were taken temporarily to military bases around the world. Your team figured out how DoD could temporarily house those that had been evacuated. What did that look like? And was there a process in place for how to do this, or was that invented for this challenge as well?
So, for DoD and also for the entire U.S. government, this really was a department-wide effort. And so while my team was a focal point for all things Afghanistan, we had a lot of regional colleagues, in particular our Middle East regional desks, and then also our Europe regional desks. And they had been working for months because, the U.S. government didn't just start, processing, special immigrant visas or other evacuees during the evacuations. They'd actually thought about this process ahead of time. And so there was even an evacuation or a transportation of special immigrant visa nominees before that. And so some of the lily pads had been before the week in August. And in particular, we had our senior DoD officials working with our embassies in those different countries to negotiate the terms of what the lily pads would look like, how long people would be there, by which process they would be vetted and let into country, and then how they would then from there go on to other locations. Our colleagues who work those different regional desks actually had to work real time as we saw the scale of what we're working with to then change those terms and really get the concurrence and the generosity of those other nations to make sure that they could temporarily house more of our evacuees.
And Kira, this is sort of where this story shifts to you and your team and the need to find permanent housing. But what state was the resettlement system in as this was happening?
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me today, Jordan. I really appreciate being here today. Resettlement infrastructure, when Operation Allies Welcome hit, was incredibly diminished across the country after years of really unprecedented low arrivals. We lost a third of our local resettlement agency offices, and those that were left, that were remaining, had lost most of their staff. These are local nonprofit organizations, and a lot of them, when refugee arrivals were so low for so long, had to make some really tough choices about where they had to put their limited budgets. And so on top of that, we had the impact of the ongoing COVID pandemic. And then to make things just a little bit more exciting, we of course have a national housing crisis as well as a labor shortage. So with all of these things in mind, it was a really tough picture, to be frank, coming into this. Back in January of 2021, we had, at the direction of the White House, started to rebuild our domestic resettlement infrastructure, but we only hit August by this point. And so we knew it was going to be a long process for rebuilding. So, we were not coming into this with a fantastic picture of what we had to offer domestically.
So to put it in perspective for the folks watching, through Operation Allies Welcome, you and your team helped to resettle more than 70,000 people. How many people were resettled through the process the prior year?
About 12,000 people. So, and that was pretty par for the course for the last couple of years leading up to that as well. And frankly, our most recent year of high arrivals was in fiscal year 2016, when we resettled 85,000 people. And that was over the course of an entire year. And when we had a domestic network that was operating at its peak, we didn't have a pandemic. Housing was hard, but it wasn't yet at a national crisis level. And it was, and even that year of 85,000 across 12 months was a very challenging year for our program. So, when I say it felt like we were faced with an impossible challenge with Operation Allies Welcome, that's the context I'm coming with.
So what are the implications of having a system that had been so depleted and having so few resources already in place to draw upon?
Well, it means that we didn't have just a well-oiled machine ready to go to receive people wherever they needed to go when they needed to get there. And, in normal resettlement, people are processed overseas, and it takes a good amount of time to process them overseas. Resettlement agencies have a fair amount of warning before they come, and they receive the case. They get full information of who's going to be in part of this family, and they'll have, 2, 3, 4 weeks. And that's if things go well. Sometimes it's longer between when they agree to serve the case and when the person shows up. So they have time to find housing, to prepare, make sure they have sufficient staffing, all of these things. And we had none of those for Operation Allies Welcome. And we had, over 70,000 people that we had to resettle in fewer than 5 months into a system that was just not set up to prepare for that. And it just made it, the positive reframing of this is that it makes it all the more incredible to me that our local communities, our partners, were able to step up and make it happen.
So how did you build those partnerships outside government to find that capacity? What did it take to figure out how to make the system work for these people that really needed it?
Well, a lot of things. We talk about it not just as a whole of government approach, but a whole of country approach. And that's really what it took to be successful with Operation Allies Welcome. It took, I think, started out with, and Hila mentioned this, really just phenomenal levels of coordination within the government. And just, we thought we were good at coordinating here in my team in domestic resettlement. We coordinate, for example, with Health and Human Services and their Office of Refugee Resettlement all the time. And we thought we did a good job of that. But we really had to ratchet everything up tenfold beyond that and really get everybody in. We had an amazing number of volunteers from across government, detailed to places that they'd never been, doing things that not only had they not done, but that we didn't have a playbook for. And just everybody coming together to make it happen. And then the next part was really engaging outside of government too. And that was so critical because this had to be a whole of country approach. Resettlement in the United States is a local thing. It works because local communities come together. And so we had to really step up how we communicate with our state partners, with our resettlement agency partners, and with local partners, and think about new partners. Think about private sector, work with Afghan American organizations. And I'll tell you, Afghan organizations across the country and veteran organizations have been amazing partners in Operation Allies Welcome, partnering with existing resettlement agencies who, as I mentioned, came into this having been really depleted in recent years. And so just rallying everybody together and making it happen.
So you mentioned needing to create a system to get people to a host community quickly and efficiently. And that was something that had to be created in response to this particular challenge. It took some ingenuity. Walk me through how you all went about figuring out how to solve that problem.
Sure. It's one of the biggest challenges with Operation Allies Welcome is that we couldn't use our existing system, our existing program. Traditionally, our programs are for people with refugee status and special immigrant visa recipients. And so we haven't traditionally served parolees, people with humanitarian parole before. And so when we were first tasked with creating this program, we had to create a whole new program, new systems, new funding sources, all of it had to be created from scratch. And we tried to do it with existing processes as a starting point. And for example, in regular resettlement, as I mentioned, when refugees become ready to be matched with a resettlement agency, they've been approved by Homeland Security to resettle to the United States. When they hit that point, we match them with the resettlement agency, and then the process for traveling to the United States starts. And it's sort of as people become ready, this constant flow of processing. Well, with Operation Allies Welcome, we had everybody here. They were all here in civilian in military lily pads, military safe havens across the country. And so we realized as we started doing it that our regular process wasn't working so well, because what would happen is we would have everybody ready to be matched with the resettlement agency, tens of thousands of people. Resettlement agency would agree to accept a case. That was all this person, this family was waiting on. And so they'd show up at the resettlement agency about 2 days later. And so it was a really hard process to function in that way. So what we did, and I will tell you, we got this idea from one of our resettlement agency partners. You know, Operation Allies Welcome was all about innovation and figuring out how we're going to make things happen in new and different ways, because it couldn't be business as usual. This was resettlement as emergency response. So we knew we had to do things differently. And one of our resettlement agency partners just put a suggestion out there, said, well, what if, could we just assign everybody and then schedule out their travel? I will tell you that sounds simple, but we have never done something like that before in resettlement. We don't have a system set up to do that. But at that point we thought, well, it sounds impossible, but maybe that could work. And so I took that idea that day to our director, and we brought in some really smart people, as we like to refer to them, from the US Digital Service and our own Refugee Processing Center that afternoon, and said, this seems impossible, but is it really? Or maybe is it just hard? And we looked at it that afternoon and then through the weekend, and we figured out that we thought we could do it. So we gave it a shot, and it worked. We were able to take all of everybody's information, assign everybody a travel window based on the community capacity. So we weren't going to send, you know, Cleveland, Ohio, all of the Afghans that were assured to Cleveland in a 2-week period. We could spread it out over several months. We could make sure we were expediting people with medical conditions, protection concerns, that we were expediting them appropriately. We could be responsive to DOD's need, their order for closing the safe havens, their military bases, and that everybody knew it was going to happen. There was a plan. And it was that I truly believe that from that one idea that somebody just said, sort of in an offhand way in a meeting, that is what made it possible for us to resettle 70,000 plus people in 4.5 months on time.
So Hila, I want to bring you back into the conversation here as well. This, for both of you, what lessons do you think you and your teams learned about working across agencies to figure out a way through this really challenging period of time? Hila, we'll start with you on this one.
Great. I would say that, first of all, if you have, you know, usually in Washington, most of our agencies, we're focused on policy, looking at a strategy or something that's long-term and not really built to apply something like that to a real-time operation. And I would say lesson one is that it's really hard, but it can be done when everybody is working towards the same goal. And so I think the most challenging part that was figured out through over communicating and synchronizing is just really making sure that people are talking to each other and all on the same time zone. So that's where the 24-hour operations were really important. But also, I think what's very interesting is, you know, for example, you know, DOD in my office in particular, we don't do refugee resettlement, but we had to be versed enough on the system to then be able to say, well, here's what DOD needs, here are the people that we're trying to help, or, you know, here's what our bases can do for temporary housing, et cetera. So I think, you know, it's always good to know more about your portfolio than what's in your portfolio, right? You have to always understand how your colleagues are fitting into the bigger picture, because in times like this where the entire government has to work at the same time, really have to understand each other and speak the same language. So we're one government, but we have very distinct cultures. And I think that's also a value of having people in positions who have different, backgrounds. And so having somebody who has state and DoD or in the White House and other backgrounds, I think is really helpful in making sure you can translate across organizations in times like this.
Kira, what about for you?
I have to agree with Hila about communication. That is so critical, over communicating and having it be bi-directional so that we're communicating within the government, we're communicating with our external partners, with state governments, with local communities, with our nonprofit organization partners and our private sector partners, but that we're listening to them too. And we are not waiting to have perfect information to share with our partners, with our implementing partners, saying this is what we know right now. It may change next week, but this is what we have right now. That went a long way, that transparency, and people trusted us that we were going to share information when we had it, because the situation was incredibly fluid throughout the whole operation and things were always changing. So just having that mechanism, we still have actually to this day, weekly Friday afternoon calls between our United coordination group and all of our partners, our resettlement agencies and the states, to talk about OAW, and now adding U4U, Uniting for Ukraine as well too. And having that, I think the other thing I would just say is being willing to pivot, being willing to try new things. We tried some things and they didn't work, and some things made it possible for us to be successful, and just being open to doing things differently than we have done, which is really hard in the midst of a crisis, to be open to trying something different and new. And it was so critical to do that.
So as you said, the work still continues, but we're looking back across a year now. How do you reflect on this experience, and how do you feel about the impact that your work has had? Is it sunken in for you, like the scale of what you've been able to achieve? Here, we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. To be honest, it's still overwhelming. Just the scale of everything, the scope of it. These are, I've worked in resettlement for a long time, and this is special. These are our allies, these are our partners. And I think everybody felt a very special commitment to this population. And I think it's complicated feelings about it too. And I will also say, we've resettled, maybe I should reframe that, we've relocated over 70,000 Afghans to the US, but the resettlement process is ongoing. That's a long process. And even under the best of circumstances, resettlement in the United States is hard. It's really, really hard to do. We're talking about people who have had to flee their country, have to restart lives here. And it's our system, which I love dearly, is based on economic self-sufficiency as soon as possible after arrival. And that is a challenge when you have just lived through an incredibly traumatizing experience. So that is on my mind constantly. But I will tell you, I just traveled to Philadelphia last week with our assistant secretary, and we marked the 1-year anniversary of the fall of Kabul. And we were there, we talked to Afghans who'd resettled in Philadelphia, and we talked to the community that supported them. And it was incredibly moving. And as hard as things are, it was very moving to see people starting new lives, and to see, kids in school, parents getting jobs. We talked to employers who were so excited to have Afghan refugees as their employees, and what did that mean to them, and how it had opened their eyes. And so I think for me, the impact is both specific to Afghanistan, but also then taking all of this, what we've experienced, what we've gone through, the lessons we've learned, the new partners we have in communities too, and building that interest and progress, and leveraging that for other refugees that we resettle moving forward too.
Yeah. Hila, how about you? How do you reflect on a year later, sort of the impact of the efforts that you and your team made?
So I don't know why this is, but somehow it seems like it's been a lot longer than a year. I mean, that period of evacuations felt like a year in and of itself. And it's pretty incredible to have been part of something so big and so historic. And I feel, even though it was hard, I feel honored that I got to be part of it. But I think in terms of the impact, you'll find a lot of people who are working on this issue just cared personally, very, very deeply personally, about the outcome, about the people who are being evacuated, about the situation, about the people who lost their lives. And it's hard not to think about what you didn't achieve, you know. And so the emails you didn't get to, the people you know who still haven't been able to leave, who are living in difficult situation. And so I think for me, it's amazing that we evacuated so many people. But on a personal level, when you think about the work you did, you just can't help but wish that you could have done more, or could have done things in a better, more efficient, greater way. And so that's what I think about. I think it's also in some ways just too soon, right? And so I know a lot of Afghans who have started a new life here, and it's pretty incredible for them. And then I also know people who are still back in Afghanistan, and they're trying to figure out what's next for them in that country. And so for me, kind of, it's almost overwhelming to reflect on all of that. I mean, the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan spanned over so many decades, and there's just still so much of the story that's untold. So it was great to be part of it, but I also want to see what's next for the country and for the people that we were able to resettle, and also those who are still trying to get out and who the U.S. government is still committed to helping get out.
I think that's such an important perspective, and thank you for sharing it. And this is a challenge that a lot of public servants, I think, face. So I'm wondering, what lessons do you think others in public service might learn from your experience or from your perspective around what you've achieved, and what also you wish you could have and didn't have the resources at the time to be able to do? Hila, I'll start with you on this one.
Great. So what's been very touching for me is that I've sat in on some interview panels or other types of speaking events within the department, where there are some of the people who are newer or either fellows or interns within the department who had volunteered to help with evacuations. How many of them talked about their role in volunteering for this particular event, and how moving it was for them, and how inspirational it was for them. So I would say that there are a lot of different things that you can do in public service and in government, but this was a very unique to be able to work on something that has very real-time impacts that are frankly life or death types of impacts. And I think it would be hard to find a public servant who is more motivated to do their work and do that job than when there are actual lives at stake. And I've heard people say something similar about different situations. And I don't think it's sustainable to do that for your entire career. You can't always be in something that's so intense, but to have had the chance to take some of the skills that you've developed as a public servant and to use it for something that's a real world, real-time scenario is also incredibly rewarding. And I think it's amazing that so many people who are involved in this, that event and being part of it has inspired them to continue working in public service.
Kara, what do you think? Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think for me, the big takeaway is that government can actually be incredibly nimble. When push comes to shove and you get people who care very deeply, and it's full, like Hila said, it's full of people who care very deeply and very personally about these really important life or death situations, especially in the humanitarian world. You have people that care deeply, and we can be nimble. We can make things happen. And it was just remarkable to see. It's continuing to be remarkable to see because the work is not over. And there continues to be, we taking those lessons learned from the last year and figuring out how can we put that into place for more sustainable infrastructure going forward that's not in part of an emergency response.
So I want to zoom out a little bit. One of the things that we've tried to do with this series of events this summer, and that we try to do with the Sammies program overall, is to show the breadth of what government does on our behalf every day, and to show folks that no matter what it is that you want to do with your life or that you already do with your life, there's a path for you in government. There's a way to make a difference. So I'd love to hear from each of you about your own personal journey to public service and why it has been a rewarding experience for you. Kira, do you want to share first?
Sure. So I have spent my entire career in government in resettlement and refugee resettlement. And I first became engaged in resettlement at a local level in my hometown, working with a local refugee resettlement organization. And I think I was in college and got paired with some local area high school students who came as refugees. And that was all it took. Just hearing from them, hearing about their stories, and watching them try to figure out what it meant to be in America and how they were going, what their dreams were now and how they were going to work to achieve them. I went to work for that resettlement agency and tried to learn as much as I could, and then decided that I wanted to work at a broader level, have a broader impact, not just at the local level. I wanted to do what I could to help make the system, the programs better, have a broader impact. And so I went to graduate school for that purpose, and got very lucky, came through the Presidential Management Fellows Program here to state, and have been very honored to been working here ever since.
Thanks. And Gila?
So my journey in public service actually started with Kira's office. So I was in college and trying to figure out what to do with one of my summers, and looked into the Department of State, internship program, looked at the different offices, and my family actually resettled in the United States as refugees. So when I saw population refugees and migration, I thought, okay, it'd be so fascinating for me to kind of understand the system behind what got my family here. And so it started with an internship at State. I loved PRM, loved what I did there. And I was working for a former presidential management fellow who advised me to look into that program when I got to grad school. And then I was also fortunate enough to become a PMF finalist, but went to graduate school with a lot of military fellows. And having worked in Afghanistan, I had done development work. There was a lot of military presence, and I'd never really worked with the military. And so they encouraged me to look at the Department of Defense as a place to start. And I ended up becoming a PMF for DoD, thought I would just be here temporarily before I went back to development or humanitarian work, and then just ended up being to work on such a breadth of different issues. And so I worked on NATO policy, I worked on Afghanistan policy, non-proliferation, cyber policy, and have just really enjoyed being able to work on issues that I would only read about in the news otherwise. So it's been both a challenging and a rewarding career, but I'll have to give credit to State for getting me interested in public service to begin with.
So always fascinated to hear these stories, and in the spirit of that, and in the spirit of encouraging a new generation to consider these opportunities, hopefully there are some young people watching today. Gila, what advice would you give for those who are considering entering a career in public service, or maybe just getting started?
So one piece of advice I have is that there are different times in your life that where you have different constraints that, for example, family, location, different things that narrow down where you want to work and what type of work you can do. And I would say that earlier on in your career, where you have a lot of flexibility, where you can take on a job where that requires some more hours, or where you have the flexibility in location, I really would definitely encourage looking into public service. Just because, like I said, and I think like Kara mentioned, there's so many interesting issues and problem sets that you're going to work on as a public servant, and you just won't get that perspective if you're not in government. And so I would say, even though the opportunities, the barriers to getting into government can be very difficult, look into internships, look into fellowships, look into the different programs that are out there that would get you into public service. And even if it's something that you don't want to do for a span of an entire career, when you have the flexibility to come to Washington or elsewhere, or be foreign service officers, etc., I would say take the opportunity, because the unique challenges and problems that you'll face as a public servant will lead to some very rewarding experiences for your career.
Kara, what advice would you give?
Yeah, I think the big thing is, I don't think people always realize how many opportunities there are in government and how many opportunities there are to look at the same issue from many different lenses with many different skill sets. And so exploring that, looking into internships, if you're still in school, especially, the internships are a great way to just get a flavor of different agencies, different projects, different policy areas, and realizing how much of an impact you can have from many different, whether your interest is from a legal perspective, a humanitarian perspective, a science engineering perspective. There are roles for everybody, and it's always blows my mind how many different opportunities there are. And then I can't emphasize enough how much a program like the Presidential Management Fellows Program is incredibly valuable if you do want to enter civil service. It's a great way to enter in and get flavor of different federal agencies through that program. So I would highly recommend looking into that.
Well, thank you for that. I want to thank you both for being here. Again, congratulate you on being Sammies finalists, and say thank you on behalf of so many of us across this country for the incredible work that you did during Operation Allies Welcome. We're really pleased to be able to lift up your story, and thank you again for the conversation today. And to all of you who are watching, thank you so much for tuning in. We have so enjoyed bringing you these conversations with our Sammies finalists this summer. You can visit our YouTube page to watch all 6 of our interviews with these incredible public servants. And if you want to learn more about the Sammies and this year's honorees, you can visit servicetoamericamedals.org, and we'll be announcing the 2022 winners in just a few weeks. So stay tuned for that. And for now, thanks for watching and have a great day.